I'm Dr. Odate, and the title of my presentation is Exploring the Detrimental Impacts of COVID-19 on Women in the Workforce. Where do we go from here? Reason. All right, we're back on, okay? The global nature of our 21st century economy has made us increasingly interconnected and interdependent across industries and markets, but especially in travel and hospitality and leisure sectors. Subsequently, our global economy became a petri dish for spreading the virus worldwide. This presentation begins with a timeline which demonstrates how quickly the virus spread throughout distant parts of the world. By December 31st, 2019, cases of pneumonia had not yet been identified as the COVID-19 virus in China. However, by January 12th, China reported 278 confirmed cases. By March 2nd, the virus had now spread to 64 countries in various corners of the world. And by March 16th, there were reported cases in 150 countries. Globally, there are currently over 174 million COVID-19 cases, and the virus has claimed over 3.7 million lives. In the US, there have been over 33.1 million cases and over 590,000 deaths. According to the Center for Global Development, women-concentrated industries were more impacted by the pandemic. Women lost jobs at a higher rate than men. More women-owned businesses faced closures. And the increased home life responsibilities brought on by the pandemic also disproportionately affected home and work-life balance for women. Politicians and pundits on this topic, as well as global organizations such as the United Nations, international labor organizations, and World Economic Forum, have surmised that the pandemic had set back the gains women have made in the workforce by decades, if not more than a generation. Deloitte's annual Women at Work survey studied the experience of a total of 5,000 women in the workforce from 10 different countries, including the US, whose lives have been devastated by the pandemic. The findings showed that, quote, women's careers, mental health, and employer allies for gender equality have all taken huge hits, close quote. Deloitte Global Inclusion leader Emma Codd noted that the pandemic had increased their responsibility at home and at work. And this, quote, had dramatically impacted their optimism when it comes to their future careers, close quote. Women shared that company cultures and policies were not conducive to enabling them to leading balanced home and work lives. In addition to those statistics before you, nearly 1 in 4 women are considering leaving the workforce altogether. And while 165,000 women left jobs between March to April 2021, 57% plan to leave their job in 2 years due to lack of work-life balance. Globally, in 2020, women made up 40% of the workforce in most countries. And in the US, 57.4% of all women participated in the labor force in 2019. This was up from 57.1%, in 2018, while men participated at a rate of 69.2% in 2019. In addition, women earned 62% of what men earned on the dollar in 1979 and 82% in 2019. Women also represented 51.8% of those employed in management, professional, and other related occupations in 2019. The numbers you see before you represent the percentage of women in those industries. Some of these sectors, namely hospitality and leisure, education, and hospitals, were some of the hardest hit during the pandemic through closings, disruptions, illnesses, and or deaths. I added childcare providers, which are predominantly owned by women, and a large percentage of women of color, as well as restaurants, hair salons, and nail salons, because those are sectors with a high percentage of women employees and or employers that were also severely impacted by the pandemic. The pandemic's impact on wages. According to the United Nations, the development of a vaccine will not stop the global impact COVID-19 has had on wages. The International Labor Organization also shared that, quote, the pandemic had slowed or reversed a trend of rising wages across the world, hitting women workers and the low paid hardest, close quote. The Global Wage Report demonstrated that the pandemic adversely impacted wages by widening the gap between high wage and low wage earners, and stressed that women and the low paid were disproportionately affected. This report also showed that, quote, after 4 years when wages grew on average by 0.4 to 0.9% annually in advanced G20 economies and 3.5 to 4.5% in emerging G20 economies, wage growth slowed or reversed in 2/3 of countries for which recent data was available, close quote. In the US, so many low-paid workers lost their jobs that average wages appeared to have risen when higher wage earners remained employed in large numbers. The International Labor Organization shared that interventions from governments and central banks to work with companies and prevent or delay layoffs also served to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic lockdowns on millions of wage earners. Otherwise, the effects would have been even more disastrous. I will now use the US as a microcosm of how the COVID-19 pandemic may have impacted unemployment in many other parts of the world. In February 2020, unemployment rate was at 3.5%, with 5.7 million unemployed. In April 2020, during the pandemic, the unemployment rate increased by 10.3 percentage points to 14.7%. This is the highest rate and the largest over-the-month increase in the country's history since the collection of this data began in January 1948. The number of unemployed persons rose by 15.9 million to 23.1 million in April 2020. Unemployment rates also rose acutely among all major worker groups. The rate was 15.5% for adult women, 13% for adult men, 14.5% for Asians, 16.7% for Blacks, 18.9% for Hispanics, and 14.2% for whites. The unemployment rates for all these groups, with the exceptions of Blacks, were at their highest. The number of unemployed persons who reported being on temporary layoff increased about 10 times to 18.1 million in April 2020. As of 2021, unemployment rate has decreased to 6.1%, with 9.8 million unemployed. As the April 2021 table illustrates, unemployment rates have now decreased significantly amongst all those major groups relative to April 2020 statistics, although unemployment rate among Blacks remained comparatively high. Also, the number of persons on temporary layoff decreased from 18.1 million in April 2020 to 2.1 million in April 2021. However, the number of people who permanently lost their jobs in April 2021 was 3.5 million. That number is 2.2 million higher than it was in February 2020. This graph shows that employers have been struggling to find workers. Since September 2020, there have been more job openings than workers applying to fill them, even though there are currently 9.8 million people still unemployed. The National Association of Independent Business says that 44% of its members are having trouble filling jobs, and it's the highest percentage they've ever seen. Owners of restaurants and employers in the hospitality and leisure industries are saying they can't fill job openings. And despite the International Labor Organization's assertion that the depiction of higher wages in the US is misleading, some economic analysts say that the pandemic has pushed employers to raise their wages just to get more positions filled. Some pundits argue that more jobs are not being filled because people, and women especially, are still having childcare issues and are home with their children to assist them with remote learning. Additionally, some people—
to say maybe just 2 more minutes.
Okay.
I'm sorry for my interruption.
Yes. Additionally, some people do not want to be outside the home because of the pandemic, and the stimulus checks and $300 federal unemployment benefits have served to lessen the urgency of seeking to re-enter the workforce by providing them with some temporary income. This chart shows that the labor force is now much smaller. As of April 2021, 2 million women and 1.5 million men have dropped out of the labor force altogether. This means there are 3.5 million less people to participate in the workforce than pre-pandemic. These are not people who dropped out and are collecting unemployment insurance. They include people who have retired, restaurant and hotel workers who have taken early retirement, and people with children at home who are concerned about the virus and have chosen not to re-enter the labor force. The last chart shows that the labor force, my apologies, I am on the wrong slide. Excuse me. My final chart reflects statistics from the state of Pennsylvania, which support the notion that in some industries, unemployment benefits are creating economic incentives for people not to re-enter the workforce. As you can see, the bars comparing regular wage to employment benefits for minimum wage, a dishwasher, hotel clerk, and preschool teacher all show unemployment benefits to be higher than earned wages for those employees. In closing, as I stated during my introduction, globally, our economies are interdependent and interconnected. Consequently, the ability to trade and travel safely around the world is paramount, especially for industries more dependent on tourism for their economic vitality. Reaching global herd immunity through vaccination will be crucial not only to arrest the spread of COVID-19 variants, but to promote a global economic recovery. Therefore, countries with the means to share vaccines with those lacking access are being encouraged to both vaccinate their respective homelands, as well as share the vaccine with countries in need, if for no other reason than to keep their country from being reinfected. For as we know, the virus respects no borders. So far, globally, there have been over 2.1 billion vaccine doses administered. Additionally, countries will need to implement strategies to promote women's reentry in the workforce. In the US, the passage of the American Rescue Plan allowed for additional funding for childcare, job training for women to enter new industries, and to encourage women's reentry into the workforce. It has also provided funds for personal protective equipment to support women entrepreneurs. The current US administration is also seeking to pass the American Family Plan, which promises to expand access to healthcare and universal pre-K, quality and affordable childcare, create more jobs, and offer better emotional support. Where applicable, countries should strongly consider embracing these proposed initiatives to encourage and support women's reentry in the workforce, especially those professing to be advocates or proponents of gender equality and equity. Thank you. Are there any questions?